Welcome, welcome. My name is Lydia X.C. Brown, pronouns they, them, sign name L. Brown. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black and teal hair, wearing glasses, a dark shirt and jacket. Behind me is a blurred room. I am the Director of Policy Advocacy and External Affairs at the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. And tonight, I'm really excited to open up a conversation on radically revealing truth, accountable disability journalism. Part of the name of tonight's event comes from a discussion that was initiated largely by Talila Lewis, Talila Lewis, and Leroy Moore a few years ago regarding extractive and exploitative journalistic practices impacting disabled people, particularly at the margins of the margins. And in particular, the conversation taking place at that time challenged the idea that journalism should be taking place in a way that exploits disabled people's stories and work, that minimizes or is reductive about our narratives, and that is not honest or authentic to the lived experiences of disabled people doing organizing and activism on the ground. Tonight, I'm really excited to bring into conversation some fantastic friends and colleagues. First, I'd like to introduce you to Cara Reedy. Cara is a journalist and producer who worked at CNN, producing documentaries, as well as writing for Etocracy and CNN Business. She has freelanced at NPR. In 2019, she co-produced a short doc for The Guardian entitled Dwarfism and Me, which was an exploration into the treatment of dwarfs in American society. She is now the director of the Disabled Journalists Association at Storyline Partners. Next, I'd like to introduce Alaina Leary. Alaina is a program manager at We Need Diverse Books, a book reviewer for Booklist, a journalist, and an affiliated faculty member at Emerson College. Her work has focused on increasing equity and access for marginalized people and has been published in outlets like Good Housekeeping, The New York Times, Refinery 29, the Boston Globe magazine, Teen Vogue, and Healthline. She lives outside of Boston with her wife, 3 literary cats, I want to know how they're literary, and a rainbow bookshelf, of which I'm very envious. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce S.E. Smith, a Northern California-based journalist, essayist, and editor. Smith's work on disability, culture, and social attitudes has appeared in publications such as The Washington Post, Time, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, Esquire, and Vice. In addition to anthologies, most recently, Disability Visibility. They received a National Magazine Award in 2020 for their work in Catapult. We are also hoping that our friend and colleague, Finn Gardiner, who is scheduled to be part of this conversation, will be able to join us, and so we'll introduce him formally when he's able to arrive. First, I wanted to ask each of you if you would talk a little bit about what your relationship to disability journalism is, bearing in mind that for all 3 of you, your work isn't necessarily focused on or primarily about disability. What does that actually mean to you, just to lay the groundwork before we move into some of the thornier questions here? And we can start off, Cara, with I know that your work has focused a little bit more on disability, so I'll kick it off with you.
So I started at CNN, and part of what I realized, I wanted to tell disability stories and stories about disabled people, partially because of my treatment in newsrooms. And I became more and more dedicated to telling those stories because of newsrooms refusing to tell them. I guess that's really where I started to really be connected to it, because in the beginning I was writing stories about like food, and we did documentaries, but like I did a documentary about Princess Diana, like, and the Duke rape case. Like, it was just sort of all over the place. But it was a little later that I really started focusing on disability.
Thank you for sharing that. I know for me, as someone who isn't a journalist, but I have worked on some reported pieces, nearly all of them about disability. That's something that matters a lot to me too, is that people who are writing stories about our communities either come from those communities directly and are able to represent those stories authentically, or are in community with those who are and are in a position to try to amplify those stories. And I know that you're not, you're in a role that's not particularly common for many disabled people to be in a position like yours. And that's part of why, again, I'm really excited for this conversation. We'll turn to SE next.
Sure. I am an extremely pale white person with curly brown hair, and behind me you can see a bookshelf and various errata from travels. For me, disability journalism really is about bringing the disability lens to all of the work that I do. So sometimes it is explicitly a story on, for example, the debate over prenatal testing and termination of pregnancies for diagnosis of disability. But if I'm doing a report about public transit or travel or any number of things, I think about, as a disabled person, what experience am I bringing to this story? And what could I be pulling out of this story to make readers think, I didn't come to this expecting a discussion of disability, but all of a sudden, now I am obsessed with the conversation about the war between strollers and wheelchairs on buses in New York City. So I kind of feel like all of my work is disability journalism, even if it is not explicitly a disability piece.
Thank you for sharing that too. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I think you and I have had this in common to some extent, that a lot of people who are familiar with me as a person or know things about my work think of me as a disability person, that everything I do is about disability. And in some respects, that's true, right? Like, because I'm disabled and because I care deeply about and I'm committed to disability justice, that shows up in all of my work. I don't stop being disabled or stop caring about disability justice when I'm working on something that isn't technically about or focused on disability. But at the same time, it can be, at least for me, a little bit frustrating to feel very pigeonholed into, well, because you're disabled or you've done disability advocacy, therefore everything you do has to be somehow related to disability or about disability. And I think that that's a tension that sometimes it can be hard to hold at the same time, but it is important to recognize that both of those truths are often present at once. So thank you for sharing that. And Cara, just to go back to what you said a few minutes ago, I am also a lover of food. So we have that in common. Alaina, I will turn to you.
Thank you. Just to describe myself for the folks who are watching, I am a white person sitting in front of a blurred background, and I have dark hair that fades into like a lavender purple color. I'm wearing a shirt that says Hire Disabled Writers, which was created by Kelly Dawson, who's a disabled journalist. And I'm drinking out of a disability visibility mug that says access is, solidarity is, disability justice is love. Those felt relevant. So I would say that I have to agree that my work cuts through disability rights, culture, and pride, and LGBT rights, culture, and pride naturally because of how intertwined those identities are with my life and existence as a person. A lot of my work hasn't been explicitly focused just on disabled people or on equity, but I always like to tie up my career by saying, that the reason that I'm doing this type of work and the through line through all of the work that I'm doing is increasing equity and access for marginalized people. It's a nice, neat little tidy tagline to explain the variety of things that I've done. And sometimes that's writing about professional clothing and what makes professional clothing. And I think that everything has a disability lens to it. And a lot of the work that I'm doing doesn't have just a disability lens. It's important to me to also include other marginalized groups and voices that can speak to parts of the experience that I personally don't have. But I feel like a lot of my work just comes back to disability rights, culture, and pride because it's intrinsic to who I am. And it's easy to get pigeonholed as well. So that's definitely something that I push back against a lot in trying to specifically pitch stories that are almost at the intersections and are not as obvious or 101 level as editors may prefer them to be.
This is Lydia. We have a request from an audience member to make sure that we clearly define what disability justice and advocacy are. So when we talk about disability justice at AWN, which is a term that comes up a lot in our work, we are referencing a framework created in 2005 and 2006 by a coalition of largely Black and Brown and queer and trans disabled people that focuses on an intersectional understanding of disability and that enables us to understand both how ableism or disability oppression is intersectional in its nature, and therefore how our liberated futures or work toward the end of ableism, past ableism, and a world without ableism also requires an intersectional vision and cross-community solidarity. There's a lot of great resources about disability justice available from our community, another community organization called Sins Invalid, which is led by some of the co-creators of disability justice. And we encourage you all, if you're not familiar with them or their work, to check them out, visit their website, and read their materials. So now I want to turn to asking the three of you what accountable journalism means generally, as well as about disability specifically. What does it mean for journalism to be done accountably? What are some examples that you can think of where you or people that you know engaged in journalism that wasn't accountable? And why wasn't it accountable? And what does it look like when journalists are engaging in work that is accountable to the communities that they are reporting on or that their reporting might be affecting? And for this one, I'll turn back to SE to kick us off.
I think accountable journalism, we talk about truth telling, but kind of more deeply provides information that is accurate and valuable and useful and ideally is actionable. If I write a story and someone reads it and goes, okay, well, that's interesting. Like, what do I do with this? Then I have failed as a journalist. And when it comes to any kind of coverage of communities that are living on the margins, there's a duty of care to the community and also to the individuals that you are writing about. So for example, if you are covering undocumented farm workers, you need to think about what are the consequences if I use this person's full name, or if I conceal this person's name but describe where they work in a way that is identifiable enough that they could face retaliation? And how does the way that I frame this community shape the way that readers respond? So, there are lots of different ways to describe where someone lives, for example, and they can be very pejorative and harmful and reinforce stereotypes. Marie Grace lives in a crowded, smelly house with 17 other families. Like, that gives the reader a real clear vision of what I think about that community and how I want them to think about them. And so there's kind of when you are truth telling and when you are either speaking within your community or in solidarity with a community or about another community, you have to ask yourself, not just what facts about this specific story is the reader going to take away, or the viewer or the listener, but how are they going to feel about this community by the end? There is a great profile of Nick Kristof that is making the rounds today. For those who aren't familiar, Kristof is a journalist and was a columnist at the New York Times for a very long time, and quit to run for the governor of Oregon, which proved to be catastrophic. His race was ended because he was not eligible. And he has a long history of covering marginalized communities in really harmful ways. And this piece really flipped the lens in a way that I liked, because all of the information is in the report is factually accurate. The reporter is telling you, this is how he lives, this is what his partner looks like, this is what he's doing. But there are very clear messages conveyed along the way. And I think that's a great example of kind of flipping the lens on people who are used to being in positions of dominance. And that's very important to me as part of accountable journalism as well. We talk a lot about, well, how do you frame low-income people in your work? Well, how do you frame billionaires? Like, let's talk about both of those things.
This is Lydia. Thank you for talking about the power of rhetoric and framing. I think that's something that, not enough of us are taught to or supported in paying enough attention to. Like, even the way that folks are talking about the shooting that took place a couple days ago in Brooklyn, right? Like, a lot of the language surrounding the shooting mirrors the kind of rhetoric we hear all the time in most reporting, in most outlets about acts of mass violence. Language describing the attacker as unhinged, as probably psychopathic, as ill or unwell, or language that signals those kinds of ideas without explicitly stating that it is the case. And for many of us who come from disabled and BIPOC communities, or disabled communities that are also religiously marginalized, that kind of rhetoric carries deeper implications too, than just the message it sends about how someone is meant to interpret it, but also messages that it sends about what we're supposed to do with that information in society. Cara, I will turn to you next.
So I spend a lot of time teaching newsrooms about how to cover disability, and their questions are always like, what words do we use? And I'm like, you should know that already. One of the biggest things that you need to worry about, though, is how you're framing people, and who has the power in the situation. So I see a lot of reporting about disability where they'll just be like, well, they were disabled, so of course they're dead now. And you're like, no, who killed them? And so there's always this sort of absence for this idea that disabled people should be dead or almost dead or treated poorly, or when you're talking about Black and Brown communities and, the school to prison pipeline, it's always this individual kid did this thing, and of course he's in the system, and blah, 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 blah. And you're like, where's the system? Like, where are the system breaks in this? Why aren't you asking these questions? One of the biggest things I always ask journalists after I do all the stats of prison populations and disability and race and school to prison pipeline, I'm like, have you guys ever asked why it's like this? Why is it like this? Why are 40% of the prison population disabled. Have you ever thought maybe the police are targeting disabled people, not disabled people just belong in jail? And so I think that for me, that's one of the biggest sort of threads is the why, and why are being accountable is asking why are people in these situations rather than just reporting the situation.
This is Lydia. I love that. Always asking why, let's question assumptions that we take for granted. Because one of the ways that ableism works, and I talk about this a lot with many other people, is that ableism disguises that it exists so that we don't even have to notice it anymore. Even for those of us who are already disabled, we just don't even have to notice anymore that ableism is present and shaping our views and shaping our values and shaping how we interpret the world around us and what assumptions we make without even realizing that we are making them. Alaina, I will turn to you last to talk about this a little bit.
Thank you. And you both had some really amazing points. I will say that for me, accountability starts in my everyday life. And I don't know that I could be accountable as a journalist or as a writer or as a professor if I'm not accountable in my everyday life. And what I mean by that is, of course, I'm impacted personally by ableism. I'm impacted personally by classism as a person who grew up low income. And I'm impacted by anti-LGBTQ attitudes. But I also have a lot of privilege as well. And so in every interaction and everything that I do, I try to be accountable just as a human being so that it carries into my work and carries into my interactions with people. So that means things like not treating a cashier negatively because of their job. It means speaking to people who are asking for money, who may be unhoused currently, instead of passing them by. It means saying hello to bus drivers and to fellow people who are on the bus or the train, not just ignoring them or stepping around them. I think accountability means acknowledging my place in the world. And that means acknowledging the ways that I may unintentionally or intentionally uphold oppressive behaviors because of my existence, because of who I am. And so I try to carry that into my work as well, by making sure that when I'm writing, I recognize that there are perspectives that I don't have about a topic that I'm going to be covering, and that there may be bias that I'm not aware of, because I'm not every disabled person. I'm not every LGBTQ person. I'm not every person who grew up poor or in the projects. I'm not. I'm one person, one human being, who is shaped by their experiences. So that's something that I try to just make an everyday practice, is looking at those things and trying to think about my place in the world and the ways that I might be able to disrupt ideas that I have about people and about the way the world works, and how can I disrupt those ideas for others. If I hear a friend saying something that might be a little fat phobic, for example, I can say something. I can say, hey, that might not be okay, and here's why. If I hear a friend saying something that, feels racist or feels anti-Semitic, I can point that out if they are saying something, even if it doesn't impact me personally. And because of that, I try to take that into my work as well, that when I'm reading through, thinking through my ideas, I'm really thinking about the people that I'm not and the people I can't be, and how they're showing up in this story or not showing up in the story. If I'm writing a piece on disabled parents, for example, which is something that I wrote last year, I'm a person who's disabled, who grew up with disabled parents, but I had to really think beyond myself about people who may be better resourced than my parents were or less resourced than my parents were. People that are not white, people that are religious minorities, people that may have had their children taken from them because of this instance. And I think that accountability starts at home, really.
This is Lydia. I agree that accountability does have to begin early, and how we talk to people who are going to be working in journalism throughout their entire lives is going to shape their later professional work. But of course, how we train journalists and how we educate journalists too. And something that, I really want to ask you, because there are folks who are here now who may be journalists themselves, people might be listening to this later who are working in journalism. And I want to ask you, what advice would you give to people who are working in a journalistic position, whether as a freelancer or they have a regular position as a staff writer somewhere? How should they interact with the disability community? What does it look like to integrate disabled people and disabled people's perspectives into pieces that aren't necessarily focused on disability? What would you want them to do and to know as your colleagues?
I'll go. This is Cara. I think one of the biggest things is to listen to disabled people. And I know that sounds simple, but there's a lot of not listening that happens, where there's assuming of, well, they're like this, and so I'm not really hearing what they say. But it's humble. I have said this before, humble yourself and just be quiet and actually listen to what people are saying. And if it challenges what you think, that's probably good. And maybe you need to investigate why it challenges what you think and stop bringing yourself so much into this, which they should be doing anyway. Not that you can throw away who you are as a person. You come to journalism as a whole person, and your experiences up to that point are how you act as a journalist. But you can challenge what you come with. And I think that's the biggest thing, because I've been in newsrooms where I'll say, hey, here's a story about this, and I know it's a story, and they're like, I don't think that's a story. And you get into this discussion, well, why don't you think of that story? I just don't. And they don't go any further past that I just don't. And so and I as a reporter and speaking to an editor, I can't challenge any further than that, because they have the power, I don't. So now when I'm training editors, I'm like, remember when you said this to a disabled reporter or any kind of reporter? Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe you didn't think it through. And I've talked to disabled reporters recently who are still going through that, where I don't think it's a story. And they don't know anything about it. It's just not what their perception is.
This is Lydia. Thank you for sharing that. That is fantastic advice. And I hope people will listen to it. Alaina?
Yeah, I could not agree more with what you just said, that listening is so key. It reminds me a lot, actually, of pre-pandemic, because I work from home, and I've worked from home since 2017 full-time as a requirement and access need for my disability. And I just have to say that disabled people are trendsetters by default. We are always doing things that are out of the box that end up benefiting everybody. I mean, who doesn't love a good curb cut when they have a bunch of crap with them? Who doesn't love a good access button to open a door when they have a bunch of bags with them? Like, disabled people as a community are creative, innovative, a cat. And we just have a lot of really amazing ideas. And I would have to agree that just listening, so many times I feel like I told people how necessary it was to work from home and how important that need was and how much that could open up opportunities, not just for disabled people, but for people who can't afford to live in certain geographic regions. Pretty much any marginalized group is going to be impacted by that. I have to say, I don't want to start listing because it really just increases access across the board for marginalized people. And I just feel like people write that off. People write off when they hear that something is an issue from a disability standpoint until they see that it benefits them, until they are 2 years into a pandemic and they're like, I really like being able to take a bath in the middle of my day. That's nice. And I'm like, yeah, it is nice. It's been nice the whole time, Bill. So I would have to agree there that listening and treating us as people is so incredibly important. I've watched so many somewhat silly, cringy videos, how to talk to disabled people, how not to be ableist in your interactions. And I don't think that there is a quick tip. The reality is that we are people, and the necessity of being human is that we will mess up at some point. Like at some point, you're going to ask an offensive question of your friend. At some point, you're going to make a mistake and just say, you're sorry and learn from it, and treat us like we're people, just like you as a person who may not be disabled probably have those interactions where someone makes a mistake to you. Just we're people and we all have unique perspectives, and two people with the same exact disability are still going to have completely different experiences and may have completely different needs. So just because one autistic person who doesn't like going to the club because of the bouncing lights doesn't mean that every autistic person doesn't want to go to the club because of the strobe lights. Just because one person who uses a wheelchair that wants you to open the door for them automatically doesn't mean every person in a wheelchair wants you to open the door for them automatically. Everybody is different.
This is Lydia. That's also really great advice to remember and to share. That, I know I literally just asked you this question, but it's also the kind of question that I tend to not like, because a lot of people will hear that question and think, oh, someone could just answer what's advice that you would give. If I just follow whatever that is, then I'm good. I'm golden. I am no longer ableist and I am doing everything right. When the reality is, a lot of how to be respectful and accountable around marginalized communities, if you're not a member of that marginalized community, it's contextual, it's relational, and there is no checklist. There is not a 10 steps that if you check off every box on the 10 steps list, that now you're perfect. Like, that just doesn't exist. Even if only because our communities are so heterogeneous. Disabled people are not all the same. And that's something that a lot of folks will miss too. They will assume, because of how oppression works, that if you talk about disability, just in general, that you mean the most privileged people within that category. You only mean white disabled people. You only mean wealth privileged disabled people. You only mean cis het disabled people. You only mean disabled people who communicate with spoken English and are from the global north. And disabled people who don't fit those descriptions, suddenly our experiences remain marginal even when allegedly disability is being addressed. So there just really is no checklist. And there is no way to say, well, you can do these 10 things and then you're done, because our lives and our realities are just infinitely more complex than that. Last, I'll turn to SE on this.
Yeah, to turn to a more practical bent in answer to this question, this always brings me back to duty of care with the communities that I work with. And when it comes to communicating with the disability community, one thing I'm really explicit when reaching out to someone or when they reach out to me is establishing access needs from the top. and saying, hey, my deadline for this story is the 18th. If that turnaround time is too short for you, that's totally okay. I'd love to keep you in mind for the future. Or do you need me to use plain English? Would you prefer that we text rather than email? So to try to be very conscious from the start, and also to alert them to the fact that these are things they can ask for. It establishes a respectful relationship between me and a source, and also teaches them that, hey, if another journalist reaches out to you and doesn't offer accommodations, that's telling you something about their work practice. And the other thing that is really important to me with sources is disabled people they don't have institutional backing. They're not coming to me from a comms shop. There's not someone from their union who's supporting them while they speak to me about this story. Often disabled academics are really surprised when I contact them and don't get any kind of training from the university communications office. So I try to be really clear about why I am reaching out, what the story is, what my angle is, where it is running, so that they can make an informed choice about whether they want to talk to me. And to also be really clear to make sure that they understand the difference between being on the record and off the record, and what I can offer them. Like, most publications don't do quote approval. So if that is a deal breaker for someone, I want them to know that's not an option, so they can choose to withdraw up front rather than sinking a bunch of energy into talking with me only to discover that I can't use any of their material. So I think that when you're interacting with any marginalized community, but especially one that doesn't have a lot of experience with journalists, it's really important to be ethical and responsible in your interactions with them, but also to teach them, like, you deserve this. If you went viral on Twitter because of a thread about how United broke your wheelchair, like, you don't have to talk to the 8 journalists who slid into your DMs, who have never covered disability issues, who are not going to be respectful. Like, it's okay to turn down requests, or to wait, or to say, I'm sorry, I can't get back to you within that time frame. And I think that that sets a tone that kind of source education carries out and builds as we move through the world.
Thank you for sharing those tips, SE. I think that the point you made about communication is so important, and I've long admired your email signature that makes that point. That people who are communicating with you have a right to be able to communicate in a way that is accessible for them and meets their access needs. And I don't use that exact same language or verbiage in mine, but my email signature, which I know, of course, you all have seen in the course of planning for this event tonight, does make note that I may not be able to reply immediately. I may send emails at weird hours. And at the same time, I do not expect other people who are receiving my emails to be able to reply at the time that I send them. I expect people to be able to reply on a schedule that works for them, and when they are planning to be working ordinarily, rather than at times where they might not have been planning to work. And, we actually have taken that into account too, just that very practical consideration of how do we interact with our community members at AWN and how we scheduled this year's webinars. We really deliberately tried to avoid scheduling around any major religious holidays of many different religions. Like, I had calendars for major Jewish and Hindu and Islamic holidays and Christian holidays up in front of me when picking our dates. I made sure we weren't scheduling too close to Shabbat in case people are observing the Sabbath. I made sure that we have some of our webinars taking place this time, which is Wednesdays, late afternoon or evening. And the rest of our webinars take place on Sundays, but in the afternoon, mid-afternoon or early afternoon. And that was intended to be such that many people would find those times to be outside their ordinary working hours. But even for those for whom that is their ordinary working hours, probably both of those time slots are not. People who might go to church on Sundays probably aren't there late or mid-afternoon anymore. And people who are needing childcare access, it may be less of an issue to have to arrange for childcare during both of those particular times. Not a guarantee. And of course, this is only accounting for people who are within the continental United States and Northern, Central, and Southern America and those time zones. It doesn't really account for people who are outside of those time zones. And so, we were thinking about how we can support people's access needs and try to be accountable to things that we know that some of our own community members have shared about, just even in hosting events for people, which I know is a bit different than like, how are you reporting a story, but still encounter some of the same considerations, that we didn't want to make huge swaths of our community feel that no one pays attention to working hours or childcare hours or religious observances. We didn't want people to feel that way. And I don't know that we, got it 100% right. I can't guarantee that, but we tried really hard to be cognizant that people's access needs and life needs might be distinct. And in part because we know that at AWN, our entire team is multiply marginalized disabled people, and yet we don't represent the entire community. So that brings me to my next question, which came up in our conversation and preparing for tonight. And I wanted to make sure we took some time to talk about what it means for you to cover particular stories. When are times that you believe that you or your colleagues should move back from telling a certain story or reporting on it? And when are times in which it is appropriate for someone who might be an outsider or hold privilege relative to a particular community to be reporting on that community? And for this one, let's start it off with Cara.
I'm in hot seat. Okay. So there's sometimes when there's like system breaks, which I think most people can report on if they really are investigating the actual system and how things don't work. But then there's some things that are cultural that, like, I'm a dwarf, so I know dwarf stuff, but I'm not autistic. And so I kind of feel like an autistic journalist sometimes should cover the autism community rather than me. And then you start talking about race and different disabilities and crossing things. And I think you just really have to check yourself. Am I the best person to tell this story? Are there things about this community that I don't understand because I'm not part of it? And so there's these larger, I'll give an example. So the dwarf community is really concerned right now because they're giving babies these growth drugs. They say that they might work for the health complications that come around with being a dwarf, except they're not testing for that. They're really only testing for height. They've said they've started testing to see if these children will have better outcomes. But so we're really concerned about that. And there's all these different things that go into that. The fact that dwarfs were used as entertainment and were enslaved in sideshows. And there's an experience as a dwarf that's very different from other people's disability, like, because we were literally dehumanized in a way that was almost clown-like. And I'm not saying other disability communities haven't been, but dwarfs loom large in people's minds because of movies like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, all of these indoctrination movies that we all watched when we were kids. That's people's first experience, most likely, with dwarfs. And I don't think someone else can really understand the contextual background when you start talking about average height parents pumping their kids full of drugs so that their kids won't look like that, so their kids won't be targeted as this thing that's not okay, because that's what they've been taught this whole time. And so so I use that example because I don't know how a non-dwarf journalist would really cover that fully. And I think it's like that for all of the different subsets of disability. And then you start talking about race and gender identity. I kind of feel like when something is that complicated, you need to just pass the mic.
This is Lydia. Thank you for sharing that. Alaina?
I really feel like you said it, but I can't agree more that passing the torch to somebody else is necessary sometimes, both from a journalist perspective and also from a source perspective, because there are times that I'm asked to be a source in something, or that I've reached out to sources and had sources say, you know, maybe this one isn't for me. I'm gonna ask that you make sure you find somebody with a more specific experience. And it's not because I haven't, but they're just, you know, trying to make sure that that's included in the story. But I completely agree. If it's something about a very specific experience that I know I don't have, I don't feel like I should be covering it, even from a journalist perspective where I am not writing about it personally in any way. Even if I'm reporting on it, I would still not feel right covering something that, you know, for example, specifically impacts the deaf community because I'm not deaf, or that specifically, you know, impacts wheelchair users because I'm not a wheelchair user. Whereas if it's something that might be broader and has to do with disability in general, I feel like I could probably cover it, but I want to make sure that I'm also incorporating sources who have experiences that differ from mine, so that other people's voices are in there and that there's a diversity of the sources who are included, that there's a diversity in the perspectives and the lived experiences of the people who are being quoted, both experts and also, you know, sources who maybe not viewed as experts, but I would consider experts on their own experience. And whenever possible with disability journalism, I have to say, I seek out experts who are actually disabled themselves, if it's possible. So if I'm looking for a therapist, I'll look for a therapist who's disabled, or if I'm looking for an attorney, or if I'm looking for a scholar, an academic, a researcher, I try to find somebody who is actually disabled. But if it feels like a story that somebody who is not me should be covering, then I shouldn't cover it. And it doesn't come up a whole lot for me with journalism, but it has come up with sensitivity reads. As a sensitivity reader, just to quickly define that for viewers, it's when someone is asking you to read over a manuscript. It could be an essay, or it could be an article, or it could be an entire book, and you're looking for specific issues of problematic or harmful representation of a marginalized group. And I personally believe I can only read for experiences that I have. So if I'm asked to do a sensitivity read for a deaf character, for example, or for another disability that I don't have, I will not do it. I get asked all the time because I have myself listed as a sensitivity reader online. But I will just say, you know, I don't feel like I can accurately do a sensitivity read on this. And I would highly recommend that you look for someone who has experience being an amputee, has experience being visually impaired or blind, someone who actually can speak to that. And I feel like that's incredibly important to do when you're a journalist as well. And in times when I've been in a position of power to assign things, I think it can be so powerful to specifically say that when you are assigning something, hey, I'm an editor and I'm going to be assigning a story about this topic. I'd really like somebody from this community to be the one to cover it, because that's something powerful that you can actually do that makes an impact and shows the publication, shows your colleagues, your boss, your coworkers, that it actually matters to have someone from that community cover the topic.
This is Lydia. And last on this, I will turn to SE.
something I always ask myself is this an experience that I personally have? If it's not, am I deeply connected to this community? What is my connection? Am I deeply resourced? Am I the appropriate person to tell this story? If I'm not, do I have someone to recommend? Who else might tell this story? What kind of impact might that have if the choice is me and a non-disabled cishet white man with limited experience? Because it's really a bummer to pass on a story and then see that happen, which has definitely been an issue for me in the past. And also, how do I want to communicate that to an editor? I really try to be conscious and say, hey, this is a really cool story. It's actually not right for me because I'm not deaf. Here's a list of deaf journalists you should talk to. And for me, a really important part of my praxis as a person and as a journalist is to do what Talila Lewis actually referred to as pass the publication. If you are not right for something and you know you're not right for something, if you are taking an opportunity from someone else, you need to pass it on. And you need to be very specific about why. And you need to have a recommendation in mind because editors go with who they know. So if I say, like, this isn't a good story for me, then it's, oh, hey, Alaina, would you be interested in? And there's a reason that for a very long time you saw the same 4 or 5 bylines on every single disability story. And people thought that was cute and funny and would joke about it with me. And I'd be like, I don't think that's funny. I think it's incredibly problematic that 4 of the top 5 freelancers in the disability space are white. But the thing I would add too, kind of to bring this back full circle, is to listen to the community. So if you have little people saying, hey, we got this covered, please stay away from it. You will not do justice to our stories. You don't know our community. You don't understand the complexities here. I don't care if you are a family member of, if you are dating someone, if you have lots of friends who are, stay out. This is our business. And sometimes that's hard to hear, but you have to go, okay, I respect that. I'm going to make sure to cultivate a list of journalists and sources to refer, because I think one of the hard things about working in this space is there is a tendency to think, well, I'm disabled, so I just know everything. And like, obviously you don't even know, I'm blind in one eye and I don't speak for all people who've experienced traumatic vision loss. And you have to really listen and pay attention and sometimes be willing to sacrifice and say, okay, people have asked me or the community to not cover this specific thing. You're done. Don't do that anymore. And I think that in a lot of journalism, that's viewed as kind of anathema and very shocking and strange that the community you are covering says no, so you stop. But consent is a really key component of good journalism. And we see so many marginalized communities suffering from bad coverage because they are not giving consent and their autonomy is being taken from them, whether it is coverage of the disability community or coverage of the Black community, where you're just like, why are all these headshots white? Like, where are the Black journalists who should be covering this? So especially as a white person in this space, I make a lot of noise, I take up a lot of space, and so I need to be really careful that I'm not stepping on someone. And sometimes that means taking a career hit, which I have done, because the health and safety of the community that I supposedly care for is more important than my paycheck. And this is something that a lot of people, especially freelancers who are really struggling for work, lose sight of.
This is Lydia. I love that. And I remember Talila Lewis talking about the concept. And, for me as someone who, like I mentioned before, I'm not a journalist by training or profession. But I have often been asked to be a source for different reported stories in a variety of formats. for all of the times that I may have been quoted in stories, there are probably almost as many times where I've told a journalist who contacted me, I'm not the person who should be quoted on this story. And you should actually be talking to, and I will name who other people are. And I think that's a practice that for those of you who are here tonight, who are also not journalists yourselves, you can also be part of. Because when you are approached by a reporter who's working on a story about an issue or a community that perhaps you are not the right person to be speaking on, you're not the person who should be quoted as the expert. You're not the person who should be quoted as the person experiencing it, like going to what Cara was talking about earlier. If a reporter called up me and said, hey, Lydia, I would love if you could comment about this thing that a lot of people who with dwarfism are talking about lately. Like, what is your take on this as a disability activist? I would say that's actually not appropriate for you to be talking to me about this as an average height person. I'm not the right person. Here are the names of 5 little people within the disability advocacy community, mostly people of color, and you should be talking to them instead. And something that I also have done as a practice, and again, if this is helpful to those of you who are not journalists who are here, is I will sometimes specify, depending on what kind of piece you're working on, I'm okay with giving a quote, but only if I'm like the 5th or 6th person that you've talked to, and I'm going to end up like at the bottom of your article. And I'm just giving my perspective of someone who works generally in disability, like in the example I just gave. But if the first 4 or 5 people that you talk to were actually little people, then sure, then it's okay if I get quoted at the very end, maybe talking about the connection generally to ableism and how this has shown up and how it parallels ableism that many disabled people experience. Sure, I guess. But I'm not commenting if you reached out to me as, oh, well, you're an expert on disability, so can you comment about this? It's not actually my place to do that. And so that's a skill that many of us need to practice and think through. Am I the right person to be commenting? Am I the right person to be giving background on this? Am I the right person to be quoted? And if not, who can I provide or suggest instead? Who can I uplift and amplify? My last question before I turn to a couple of our audience questions is, well, what do you do if you realize you've got it wrong? When you realize you've made a mistake, you published something in a way that wasn't accountable, that wasn't representative, you acted in an exploitative or harmful way. What do you do if you've been called out publicly or privately? How do you take ownership and accountability for when you get it wrong? And for this, I'm going to kick it to Alaina to start.
Thank you. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to add something to what you just said about passing the publication, which is that I think it can be also so useful to pass the publication in situations where the story is just fun or well-paying. Something that I'm trying to do is when I have too much work, when I can't take an assignment, it's time to pass the publication to somebody who maybe is newer or is looking for work or recently left their job to be a full-time freelancer, and I know they're trying to pick up clients. Pass the publication when it's not just about disability or race or homophobia or transphobia. Pass like fun, fashion, food, home decor too. But yes, I will jump into accountability when you have messed up as well. That is so incredibly hard. And I just want to acknowledge that when you're in that situation, it's obviously very difficult. And I think where a lot of people struggle with this is how personal it feels when you make a mistake, especially if you're someone who takes your work very seriously and really strives to be accountable and strives to not do any harm and strives to publish stories that really tell good stories, that are accountable to the communities that we're writing about. It's hard to hear that. It's hard not to take that personally. And that's where I would say to start, by trying so hard not to take it personally. Try to separate yourself from your work when you are not making a mistake, so that when you do, because it is inevitable that as a human being, we will all make mistakes at some point, and no matter what our careers are, right? Even if we're not journalists. And so separating your identity from that work as often as possible and as early as possible is so critical, because that way you will not see it as a personal offense or a personal attack. You can step back from the mistake, look at what has happened, make note of it, make sense of it. You know, I try to survey what's happened, like, okay, here's the situation. I'm going to try to review this with as unbiased eyes as possible, see where it went wrong. If possible, talk to a trusted friend, somebody who, you know, you wouldn't be placing an undue burden on. So, for example, if you've messed up in a way that is racist, do not find your friend of color, right? So if it's like, if you've messed up and you've been called out for something that specifically is about a community, do not find your friend who's from that community and place an undue burden on them. I'm talking about bringing in somebody else who isn't going to be personally harmed by this, and ask them to have their perspective on it if they're willing to lend, you know, an eye or an ear or whatever to your situation. And I believe that then it's important to apologize. And I know we throw around this word accountable, but take accountability. Say, I did make a mistake and I'm sorry. And here's how I'm going to do better in the future. Here's what practices I'm going to implement into my work in order to not make this mistake again. And try not to over explain. I mean, I know everybody differs on this, but trying to explain too much about why a mistake happened, I think, can take away from the apology. So I would try to keep it at, I did this, I'm sorry, genuinely sorry, and here's what I'm going to do in the future so that it doesn't happen again. And it can be as something as small as the language that you used in a story, or a missing perspective, or something that may have been unintentionally problematic. I think it happens to all of us, but it's so important to just try to separate yourself from that mistake so that you don't feel so personally entangled by it, and so that you can really see, okay, as a person, this happened, it probably will happen again, but here's how I'm going to move forward so that it doesn't happen again in this exact same way. Here's some education I might do, or, you know, checks and balances, I think, can be helpful if it's something that you think, okay, well, this is a part of the system of how I was doing my reporting. You know, is there something about that system that could change as well to catch checks and balances? Somebody else could be reading your work. I think as journalists, we're all a part of an ecosystem too. So a lot of it is about identifying how exactly this happened. Is there something that could be changed about the way that the story went through the process of pitching, being approved, being drafted, being edited, and then being published, that could catch things like that in the future? So that's where things like sensitivity readers come in, or, you know, having multiple colleagues read over something and approve something before it goes public. So I do think that it can be a system-wide issue as well, but it's just incredibly important to see it as not personal, professional, and something that you can change moving forward so that you don't sort of, you know, let it hold you back from the work that you're doing to, you know, I think people get really mired in like guilt and shame when they've made a mistake. So it's important to separate so that you don't let that drag you down, and that way you can actually take accountability for it.
Thank you for sharing that, Alaina. SE?
Sure. For me, when I make mistakes, I have a whole like complicated protocol document because I'm a process-oriented person, and I learn from my mistakes. But kind of my first question is, can this mistake be remedied or mitigated in some way? Like, this piece has already been published, it exists in the world, but it's online. So I can request that the editor update the language and put in an editorial note. Yes, that is a cat. Ash is really excited that dinner is happening soon, and would like everyone to know. So kind of, and also in that conversation with an editor, I will say, how did this happen? What can we do to prevent it? Kind of go through the internal conversation about preventing future mistakes on my part or someone else's. And sometimes it's not possible. Like, I had something go to print where a copy editor changed every instance of autistic to person with autism. And I did not see the final galleys. So I saw it when I got my contributor copy and opened it and was very upset, as were a bunch of people who started screaming at me on the internet because why are you using person first language, blah, blah, blah. I thought you knew better than this. It was a scene. And in those cases, you have to kind of move on to my secondary step, which is always to take the time to formulate a thoughtful apology. I think especially on the internet, there's a react versus respond that happens. So like I could dash off a really quick, like, oh, sorry, I did a thing. But people are still going to be mad at me, and people are going to be mad at me no matter what. So I would rather take 2 hours if I need to really think about how I want to communicate and to say, in this article on X, I used this term. I now understand that is not correct. People from that community have reached out to me to say that is a racist slur. I apologize for that. It was racist. It reflects poor reporting practices. And I do, I don't think that you want to go into in-depth specifics on how something happened, but explaining how something happened briefly is an important part of an apology, because it's part of taking ownership of your actions and saying, this occurred because of a thing that I did. I understand what I did and why it was wrong. And a lot of apologies are very kind of like, oh, I'm really sorry about the mistake that I made in this article. It's like, okay, well, what mistake was it specifically that you made? Do you understand why it is wrong? Or are you just kind of saying things because people are screaming at you and you're trying to get it to stop? So I really take the time to sit down and formulate and make sure that I do understand what I did wrong. And I communicate that so that people know, and also so that people do not make the same mistake. And I try to avoid justifications of like, oh, well, I meant this. Like, well, obviously you didn't communicate that very well, did you, buddy? And then, yes, to talk about next steps and say, in the future, I will not be using this term. In the future, I will be more mindful of X. In the future, I now understand this is a topic area that I'm not qualified to cover, so I will not be doing stories about this. To kind of create a clear mechanism for accountability and what is happening. And, it seems like a small thing, but whether I am writing something that is getting posted somewhere or doing a Twitter thread or any kind of communication, to again, really clearly end on, I messed up, this is what I did, this is why it was wrong, I apologize, full stop. And the other thing that I have noticed, and Alaina maybe experiences this too, because it seems to be a white person thing, is like a bunch of people will rush to like, tell me what a great job I did apologizing, or like, I don't know why people are yelling at you. It was an honest mistake. Anyone could have done that. People misread you. And I either do not respond to those or just straight up say, this is not appropriate. And I've noticed it seems to make people very uncomfortable, but it doesn't, when you are apologizing, the people who are rushing to tell you you're doing such a great job and you're so good, those are not the people that I am interested in hearing from. I did the bare minimum of what is required as a human being. And so I can correct my error and work on moving forward and not make it about me, which I think on the internet in particular can be very challenging because everything is happening so fast. As Alaina says, everything feels very personal. And you kind of have to be able to say, like, here's my apology. I am stepping away. Like, I'm not engaging in a tit for tat back and forth about this. This conversation isn't over, clearly, because we all have more learning and growing to do. But this is not going to be a referendum on whether I'm a nice, good person who did the right thing. Like, we've already established I did the wrong thing. Let's talk about how we're fixing it.
Thank you for sharing that. This is Lydia. And I've also just found that phenomenon just reeking of privilege and fragility. People who experience or are more proximate to positionality of privilege, just rushing to try to reassure themselves by complimenting an apology. And I'm like, what is the purpose of that? I mean, if someone is your friend, having that conversation in private, sure, I guess that's one thing, but just seeing that play out really publicly reveals a lot of underlying fragility. And I really think it speaks to a base desire of people who, whether they're ability privileged or racially privileged or wealth privileged or what have you, wanting to assuage their own guilt and fear of whether or not that they're going to be criticized or they're going to be called out in some way. Cara, I'll turn to you for final thoughts on this, and then we have one of our questions from our participants here that I want to elevate.
I kind of feel like Esty and Alaina kind of covered it. I think you just really have to, a lot of the answers to is humble yourself. And if you made a mistake, like Alaina said, if you made a mistake, say I'm sorry. It's really not, I've seen a lot of journalists online where somebody will be like, hey, you made a mistake. And how dare you? I'm a Pulitzer winner. And you're like, okay, but this isn't Pulitzer winning work. So say you're sorry and do better next time. That's fine. And I think there's having been in newsrooms with very ego-driven talent, as they like to call themselves, I find the most disgusting part of that is the inability to be accountable. And in my mind, if you're not accountable, then you're not really a journalist either, because that's the whole point. Like, we're supposed to be witnessing what's going on and reporting back so the rest of the world can get a picture of it. But if you're not accountable to the people that you're reporting on and you can't apologize, then maybe you shouldn't be doing the job. So, I mean, like, to me, the best part of being a journalist is learning and studying and finding out about people. And if I make a mistake, I want to be the first one to be like, oops, I am so sorry. And I just learned and I won't ever do it again, because it's my job to never do it again. That's my job.
Thank you for sharing that, Cara. And, that's advice that a lot of folks who are working in a professional position really should take to heart. Like, part of your job is being able to work accountably in community. And if you're not willing and able to practice taking accountability and accepting that you might be wrong sometimes, then you're going to need a lot of support to try to stay in that job. Or, maybe that's not the right job to be in. That's not the right profession to be in. So we have a question from Paul Daniel, who says, it appears that mainstream corporate media has a habit of relying on stereotypes about people with disabilities, regardless of the details of the story. Why? What benefit does promoting stereotypes accomplish? And any one of you is free to answer that question.
I mean, it upholds the status quo, right? Kind of much in the vein of like white people reassuring each other for apologizing. If you have to acknowledge that something is disableist, you have to interrogate your own complicity in that system. So if you read a story that's like, oh, this kid's class raised money so that he could get a power chair, and it's so inspiring and adorable. And the story is not talking about like Medicaid coverage for wheelchairs and why it is terrible, and access to home and community-based services, and the fact that he can't get into his house because it has stairs. Like, those are all things that complicate the personal, inspiring narrative. And mainstream coverage of disability is about not making you feel bad that disabled people exist, not making you feel bad that you are contributing to social structures that make it more difficult to be disabled, and also upholding, especially in the US, the cult of individualism and personal responsibility. So if every story you read is about how disabled people need to take care of themselves, your big takeaway here is that, like, this is not my problem, and I don't need to think about how I interact or engage with this community. And that plays into conversations about retrofitting transit to make it accessible. Or when I was living in San Francisco, there was a lawsuit around the fact that a member of the Board of Supervisors could not get onto the dais because it has stairs, and she used a wheelchair. And the entire city was in an uproar about this. There was nonstop news coverage. And it wasn't, oh my God, we have a public building that an official who's elected can't use. It was, she's so selfish. This building is historic. If she wants a ramp that badly, why doesn't she just pay for it? Well, she could just sit below the dais, et cetera, et cetera. And so mainstream media and mainstream culture want to make sure that things stay the way they are, because that's the path of least effort.
I'm going to jump in. I also feel like, so it's a circle, like newsrooms are really discriminatory and segregated. And so a lot of the people that are in charge are white cishet men. And so I literally had an editor once, I was pitching him, it was years ago, and I said, let's do a story in personal finance vertical about the disability tax and what that, like, calculate what that really means for people in poverty. And he looked at me and sighed and said, ugh, nobody cares about that. And I said, well, you know, disabled people probably do. And he said, yeah, that's not our target, and we don't care. And so we're not going to do it. And so it's a circle. Like, if the same people are in the news, and this speaks to what SE was saying, like, it keep the power where it is. Well, those guys that are up at the top of the ladder, they don't want you to report about the things that are system breaks, because the system's working for them. So why report about it? And I'm not saying all people who are white, male, heterosexual are all like that, but you do have to wonder about news organizations in general, that they're incapable and unwilling to cover these stories properly, like what's going on there. And I can just tell you, if you peel back the lid, you can see who's in there, and it kind of correlates with what gets covered.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with that. It is the entire foundation of we need diverse books, except with book publishing. It's one of the whole reasons that the organization exists, is because so many people in publishing, and this applies to books and to newsrooms, magazines, online publications, are white, straight, cis, non-disabled, not religious minorities, not coming from, they're coming from wealth privilege, so they are not lower income or poor. And I think that it directly correlates with the kind of coverage that we're getting. And I also think that it requires a lot of work and a lot of effort for somebody to decide to cover these disability topics that may not be considered mainstream. You know, if you are working for one of these mainstream publications that typically does not cover these stories, and you want to see it covered for some reason, perhaps because you're an editor who cares about these issues, you are facing a mountainous hurdle in arguing and advocating for that. I have friends who work at more mainstream major publications who are in positions of power, such as editors, relative positions of power, if you will. And they have had to advocate for years for disability-centric stories to be covered. Whereas when you are working for maybe a less mainstream publication, where these types of stories are centered, RIP Bitch Magazine, you are not going to have as much of a fight because the editors, the people in power are already used to covering that. That is central to what they want to cover. It's something that is in the basis of their mission. And so it's an uphill battle. And at the end of the day, somebody is going to be thinking to themselves, how long am I going to keep doing this uphill battle? And they decide to ultimately give up and give into those exact systems of just like, let it be what it is. Let's do another story about outfits going from day to night. Like, we're all going to need that information someday, I guess. How to transition from day to night.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I want to thank all of you for your time this evening. I'm hoping that Finn will be able to join us for a future conversation. And I'm sure that something just came up. And I am really grateful to have been able to share this conversation with the three of you, Alaina, Cara, and SE. I consider you all colleagues and I hope friends. And I also want to thank our team that made tonight possible, including Nancy, Kaylee, and Catherine from AWN, as well as our interpretation team, Suzanne and Sarika, and our captioner, Heather. We really appreciate you in helping make this event possible. Please continue to share your questions and your thoughts on Twitter and other social media. Our hashtag is #LiberatingWebinars, and our next program is coming up in just a couple of weeks, and we hope that you will join us then. Until then, good night, and have a fantastic rest of your week.